Hi, my name is Liz Hiller with NACE. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Trend Watch, New Data on the Gen Z Recruitment Landscape. We encourage you to actively participate in the chat and Q&A, and it is my pleasure to introduce Kate Beckman, Director of Community and Insights for RippleMatch. Take it away, Kate.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. So excited that you're joining for today's webinar, which is focused on the latest data from RippleMatch, all about the Gen Z recruitment landscape. So really excited to walk through a lot of data that we've collected over the last month or so. So welcome, everyone. If you want to say hello in the chat, I think it's always nice to get the conversation going right away and just kind of introduce ourselves. It's helpful for me to know who's all in the audience, where you're calling in from, the companies you're a part of. So definitely say hello in the chat as we get things started. And once again, to introduce myself, my name is Kate Beckman. I'm the Director of Community and Insights here at RippleMatch. So I'm in charge of all of our educational programming for the university recruitment community. I conduct our research on Gen Z and talent trends. Would love to connect on LinkedIn. I'm frequently posting content, data, and through my own weekly newsletter called Wavelength. So if you really like these data insights, I try to publish on a pretty regular basis. So it's a good way to kind of keep in the pulse of what we're releasing. So definitely feel free to connect on LinkedIn, and we'll get started shortly with the data. But welcome, really excited to see everyone in the chat introducing themselves. And I'm calling in from Brooklyn, New York today. So it's always fun to see where everyone else is located. In terms of what RippleMatch is, for those who aren't too familiar with us, RippleMatch helps our partners hire the best early career talent more efficiently than ever before. So we're the only AI-powered early career recruiting platform, and we help our partners reach the right talent, increase efficiency, and improve diversity. The way that we do that is we use AI to find the best candidates in your applicant pool and our talent network. So we automate the most time-intensive parts of university recruitment, from automating inbound applicant review to automating sourcing, to really help you focus on forging those strong connections with candidates by really finding the best talent. And so we're bringing in candidates from our own network, but then also automating the application review process from your sourcing tools, your job boards, and your campus visits. So definitely, if you want to find out more about RippleMatch, I'll be happy to connect you with our team. In terms of the trends that we're going to be talking about today, and on the next slide, I'll share a little bit about the data set that we'll be going over, but there's 4 key areas that we'll be covering. First is application and event trends. So looking back at the past year of recruitment and really kind of what happened. We're going to be looking at offer trends. So why are candidates accepting offer these days? A bit about renege trends, as well as how frequently they want to be in touch after accepting an offer. We also have some interesting data on salary trends as well as role trends. So the kinds of skill sets recruiters are looking for these days, the kind of schools they're recruiting from, and then relocation trends. So some really interesting data on what Gen Z candidates are actually viewing in terms of where they want to relocate after graduation or for an internship. In terms of the data set we'll be looking at, there's a couple different data sets that we're pulling from, actually. So we looked at the data from the RippleMatch platform over the past recruitment year. So August 1st, 2023 to May 1st, 2024 was the analysis period where we looked at all of the hundreds and thousands of data points, from recruiter behavior to also candidate behavior on our platform. So we'll be sharing some of those trends. And then we also have a brand new pulse survey that was conducted in mid-April. And I'll try to point this out throughout today's session, that this is data from our platform. This is data from our pulse survey, just so you have an idea of what data set that is. But we'll be going over that pulse data in addition to the platform data. In terms of new assets, we're always releasing new stuff at RippleMatch, but we have a brand new report, actually, and I'll drop the link in the chat here. So this is a brand new salary benchmarking report, which I know is really relevant for a lot of folks. Super comprehensive report. It's actually pulled from the active job and internship listings on our platform from August 1st to April 1st. It's based on 1,100 roles, and it spans more than 20 business functions. So it shows both salary and intern pay. So this is something that it's free for RippleMatch partners, but definitely check out the report if you're not a RippleMatch partner, see if it's something you're interested in. But I'll be going over some of this data throughout today's presentation, some highlights and high-level things. So you'll definitely get a taste of this report in today's presentation, but just wanted to share that link and that listing here, that this is our latest asset that we've released, and it definitely is a very robust one. But we'll go over some of that data in today's presentation as well. But let's dive right into the trends. And if you have questions about some of this data, you can feel free to write that in the Q&A throughout. I do try to check that as we go along the presentation, just in case there's questions that are relevant for each section. Otherwise, I will leave those until the end of the presentation as well, if it's a more general question. But I definitely encourage you to comment on any of this, share anything that you're seeing in your own work stream about relevant trends. I always think it's great if the chat is active, if folks are sharing their own experiences. So definitely feel free to write in the chat about that. So let's start off with our application and event trends. So first set of data I wanted to share is a look at when candidates this past year were really submitting their applications to kind of show you, if you're looking ahead to fall and when to plan, when are candidates most active in actually submitting those applications? As you can see here, STEM students are most active in those fall months, understandably. So the largest share of applications that come from STEM candidates are in September and October. Interestingly, non-STEM candidates actually are submitting applications throughout the entire year. So you can see that the share of applications submitted by non-STEM candidates actually peaks in February of 2024. So when you're kind of considering, when should I be connecting with candidates? Are candidates searching for opportunities all year? Definitely, if you're someone that, plans all of your recruiting in the fall, but you're hiring for some of those positions that call for non-STEM candidates, keep in mind that a lot of those candidates are really ramping up their job search in the winter months rather than adhering to that fall schedule. Another application event trend, we saw that recruiters on our platform were responding to candidates within that ideal window of 5 to 7 business days. So we saw that the median response time on our platform for recruiters to go through candidate applications was about 6.5 days, with some of the top users accomplishing that in about 2 days. This is really interesting data. We've constantly collected that Gen Z candidates really want to hear back from recruiters within 5 to 7 business days, which definitely could be a challenge, but we do see that the average, at least on our platform, is achieving that ideal response window of 5 to 7 business days. So just a helpful benchmark to know that there are teams out there on average that are achieving that really ideal window that Gen Z candidates want, though of course the lower percentile is sometimes taking as many as 3 weeks to get back to candidates. In terms of events, I'm not sure if folks have experienced a similar breakdown, but we saw that, while a lot of the events hosted on our platform were virtual, we're seeing the attendance rate is kind of a bit of a split there. So 60% attendance rate for in-person events and 41% for virtual. And just for a bit of context here, folks that use RippleMatch, they use our events management platform, which means they can host their events on RippleMatch. They can also host in-person events, which helps with the check-in process. There's a QR code, so candidates can easily be checked into those different events. So what we saw here is that attendance rates definitely do vary depending on in-person or virtual. And as you can see, this stays pretty consistent for virtual attendance rates. Throughout the month, it stays between 35 to 40%, whereas in-person attendance rates definitely vary depending on the season. So we see that a lot of in-person attendance was a lot higher in actually, right when candidates were kind of picking up their job search spikes again in March. And then interestingly, as we kind of wind down the recruitment season, we do see that the in-person attendance rate drops, but the virtual events attendance rate does increase, likely because candidates maybe are like, oh, I really need to land that job. I'm going to attend these events that I'm RSVPing for. So kind of a helpful takeaway here is that your in-person events, they definitely might vary over time. So it can be harder to really predict what number of RSVPs you need. But for virtual events attendance rates, it stays pretty consistent throughout the months. You can start to get a sense of how many RSVPs you need to get in order to have that ideal attendance number. In terms of applications, so this is data that we've kind of shared consistently over time, but we're seeing that 65% of students are submitting more than 100 applications in their job search. So this is pretty consistent as we've continued to survey this question. Every several months, we're seeing candidates are predicting they'll submit more than 100 applications, really the majority of candidates. So, but a quarter of candidates say that they'll predict they submit less than 50 applications, but by far the majority are really predicting a really high volume search by the end of it. And that's not something we predict will change in the coming next fall recruitment season. And then finally, how are candidates actually discovering opportunities? What are the avenues that really influence them? So we asked the question when deciding which roles to apply for, which of the following avenues are influential to you? And This is interesting because this is the share of candidates who actually selected very influential for the following avenues. So you can see that the most influential thing is the classes that students have taken in school or their academic major, followed by previous internships or work experience. And then third is going directly to career pages of companies that they're interested in seeing which roles are available, as well as, searching manually for roles or having them recommended to a job search platform. Some areas that are less influential is we aren't seeing necessarily advice from friends showing up as being hugely influential. Same with family. Only 20% say that roles that show up on social media are very influential to candidates. So just an interesting note that while, social media of TikTok, Instagram can be helpful for employer branding, it's not necessarily influencing that career path and, which roles to actually apply to. We're really seeing that comes up in the academic majors, the classes, previous internship or work experience. And then you see a couple here in the middle section as things like advice of a professional mentor, in-person events, but it's largely in this section to the left here. And I see a couple questions have showed up, so I'm just going to check those quick. The presentation be available after the event. Yes, I do believe that NACE will be sending out the slide deck. And if they don't, you can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and I'll be sure to share it. And then there's a question, if you found that attending career fairs has gone down. So I have an interesting data point that shows, and I didn't include it on this slide deck, but it is a recent survey we conducted of recruiters specifically that looking ahead to fall, we see that recruiters are planning to attend major specific career fairs instead of campus-wide career fairs. So my takeaway there is that this past year, I think it's possible that the sort of campus-wide, all university career fairs were probably less effective than some of those major specific career fairs. So I think as it becomes, deciding where to spend that time and money, I think the larger career fairs are probably just yielding less results and probably less students are attending, less relevant students are attending just the university-wide career fairs. And maybe opting for those major specific ones. So that's what I would say about the career fair attendance is it's hard to say if it's gone down, but I do think that based on this past year, recruitment teams are more planning to do those major specific ones that are more niche. I'm just gonna get through a couple of these questions and I'm gonna check the chat really quick. Okay, and what is the number of respondents? So this specific survey from the candidates, that was 2,200 students that answered this survey. So this is a representative sample of 2,200 students that attend universities all across the country, have different majors and general demographics. Okay, I'm going to keep moving on, but this is great. Definitely submit your questions in the Q&A in the chat as I go through the slides. It's always great to be able to answer the questions when they're most relevant. So definitely feel free to submit those questions and I'll check as we go along. So key takeaways from this section, so you can see STEM versus non-STEM candidates are really submitting those applications at different times. We see that, candidates submitting those roles for STEM are really doing that in the earlier fall months, but non-STEM roles are seeing that higher peak in February. Recruiters are definitely striving to achieve that response window of 5 to 7 business days, and event attendance rates definitely depend on format. So in-person events are seeing higher attendance compared to virtual, and virtual rates are really staying consistent. Moving on to some offer trends, which I know is pretty relevant as a lot of folks are just, fully wrapped up their recruitment season and are kind of regrouping ahead of the fall. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is reflecting on this season. So this was part of the survey that we did in mid-April. So we asked candidates about that had accepted an offer when they first learned about the company they ultimately accepted a position with. And what's interesting here is, while 51% of candidates say they discovered that company in that same time frame that they were searching for the opportunity, 49% of students actually say they learned about the company they accepted an offer with prior to their active job search. So about a third said it was earlier in their college career due to proactive outreach, events, general brand exposure, and 16% said prior to college due to, proactive outreach, events, or general brand exposure. So 49% of candidates that went on to accept an offer had had that brand awareness of the company they accepted the offer with, ahead of actually that job search. So it's definitely encouraging here that, there's a lot of course, candidates that are discovering a company for the first time and then they're accepting that offer. But it also is encouraging that, those employer branding investments definitely are paying off with candidates, oftentimes having that awareness before they do accept that offer. In terms of how often candidates are receiving multiple offers, from this you can see nearly 50% of candidates report receiving 2 to 3 offers during their job search, though the largest share of candidates, about 37%, are receiving about 1 offer in their job search. So we're not seeing, an overwhelming share of folks receiving 2 to 3 offers, but we definitely are seeing that the space is competitive and candidates are ideally trying to receive multiple offers so they can really decide, which is their best bet before really solidifying that offer. When they accept an offer, I know folks are often wondering, how should we be reaching out to candidates? How frequently should we, talk to them? What kind of material should we be sending them? So we ask candidates ahead of starting your internship or job, how useful is each kind of communication that you could hear from a company? As you can see, the number one thing you could share with your candidates is actually a checklist of everything that they need to know before starting their role. So sounds, pretty simple, of course, like, why wouldn't you send a checklist? But that's something that candidates 74% would find very useful. So if you don't have something that's formatted as that kind of, hey, you're starting in a month, this is everything that you need to know, that's something that could be really helpful for candidates and they definitely would appreciate. The second most useful thing, so selected by the second largest share of candidates, is really being connected to a company community. So connected to a company mentor, someone who's separate from a manager to speak with before starting, connected to other interns or new hires through a group chat or forum, and being connected to your manager before starting. So about 70% of folks say that would be very useful. A couple of other things that are, definitely still considered somewhat useful, being provided with a brand packet to announce, any acceptances with that company, some optional orientation events to learn about best practices of working in an office. And then we do see that general company news is somewhat useful, but it's not necessarily, the most useful thing you can share with the candidates. So if you're wondering, where to kind of put those resources of how to stay in touch with candidates, definitely figuring out how you can either connect them with their coworkers or have that checklist before, coming up with a whole newsletter about company news is something probably be the better use of time. In terms of how often candidates want to hear from you, after accepting that role, how often would you like that company to stay in touch? We see that candidates really would like to hear from the company every 2 to 4 weeks. So you can see actually the largest share of candidates did select every 2 weeks. 52% would really like to hear from a company leading up to that start date every 2 weeks. About 27% say every 4 weeks. So the takeaway here is, of course, this is was done in mid-April. So candidates that maybe are approaching the start dates are really wanting to hear from companies where if you accept an offer in the fall and you have to wait 9 months, every 2 weeks might be a little much, but if you can somehow schedule some communications really in that 2 to 4 week spot, candidates, it is something that they would appreciate. They do want to be in touch. They want to hear from you. And I imagine they might get, stressed if there's radio silence for multiple months. So just know that candidates do want to hear from you and they do want to stay in touch leading up to their start date. Which leads to a relevant point about reneg. So I'm sure, hopefully it's not been too bad this year, but we've definitely heard anecdotally that candidates have continued to renege on their offers. We've been conducting research, every twice a year to really find out how willing would candidates be to renege on an offer. Usually about 70% say, yes, I would, consider reneging on an offer if a better one came along. And this question we asked, have you rescinded an offer for a new role? If so, why? So of the candidates that had accepted a job offer and took this survey, 74% said, no, I've not rescinded an offer, but 26% did say that, yes, they had rescinded an offer for a new role. Curious if that is in line with what anyone has experienced, if your reneg rate's been, in the high 20%, or have you lucked out and had only maybe, 5 to 10%. So if you have any insights or comments here in the chat, definitely add that in so folks can hear what everyone's experiencing. But in terms of why candidates decide to rescind an offer for a new role, this is pretty in line with the reasons that we've just consistently seen over time. So career fit, so long-term career goals and higher salary / pay for the new position, those really show up as the top reasons a candidate would rescind an offer. So those are showing up as why candidates did go ahead and do that. And that's typically the reasons why candidates predict that they would rescind an offer if they ended up doing that. I see a question. This question is, do you happen to say if it's higher or lower than previous years? So this isn't a question that we've asked every single year. I know 2 years ago, it was about 20% that said they had rescinded an offer. So between 20 and 25% is typically when we've done this survey of asking candidates, like, have you actually rescinded an offer? That's typically what we tend to see. But this is definitely a bit higher than we've seen in previous surveys. That said, the willingness to renege, which we had also asked in the survey, I just didn't include it in the slide deck, has stayed about 70%. So 70% of candidates say, like, yes, I would rescind an offer if a better one came along. It doesn't mean they all have done that, but this is the percentage of candidates that have actually gone ahead and rescinded that offer. Is there a higher rescind rate for STEM? I didn't analyze that between these two. That's something that actually I'd like to go back and take a look at. I will say I have analyzed if there's a higher willingness to renege between STEM candidates and non-STEM, and even different demographics like Gen Z women or Gen Z men. And what I found is there's actually not any kind of discernible variable of candidates being more willing to renege on an offer. It typically has been in that, like, maybe 1 or 2 percentage points that say, like, yes, I'd be willing to rescind an offer. So the willingness to renege actually doesn't vary depending on academic background, but that is something actually that I'll go back and check if there's a difference between the actual candidates that did rescind their offer, STEM versus not STEM. It's a good question. So shifting gears in terms of just some reasons that candidates do decide to actually accept offers. So I know internship season is about to start, so I wanted to just share this slide about why candidates actually accepted internship. What are they hoping to get out of it? And point out that the number one thing candidates want when they're entering an internship is actually a return offer for a full-time role. So they, of course, would love to get experience working on real-world projects, new and more developed hard skills, but they really are going into this hoping that they can be with that company for the long term, or at least have that security of that return offer. So as you're entering your internships, really kind of considering how these three things play into, hosting your internship, having that programming is a really good way to resonate with candidates and make sure they know where they stand and what is that path to actually get the offer if that is something that you have available. I'm just gonna answer these questions really quick. In terms of why candidates have accepted general offers, so full-time offers, competitive compensation and benefits, and role aligning with long-term career interests also shows up here. So as you saw, candidates rescind offers for compensation and long-term career goals, and that's also why they're accepting these offers. So just as you're kind of planning ahead for your recruitment processes next year, is really figuring out, one, how you can offer this competitive compensation and benefits, but then also designing your interview process to really align with what candidates are looking for. Knowing that candidates rescind on offers if they perceive it doesn't align with their long-term career goals, figuring out how you can really showcase that in your process and screen for the right candidates so you know that they're actually aligning with what your company does have to offer in the long term. Last one here, just on long-term career fit. We did ask candidates, how long do you expect to stay in an entry-level role before receiving a promotion? And as of this year, we see that the kind of standard share of time is around 1.5 to 2 years. So, or, a year to 1.5 years. So the majority of candidates are really thinking between, 1 to 2 years that they would receive a promotion. Notably, this was much higher in spring 2022. We saw that 75% of candidates thought that they could get a promotion from an entry-level role after just 1 year in the job. But as the economy has shifted, we've seen differences in, candidates landing those roles. Is definitely a more competitive, tighter job market. We've seen those expectations definitely drop a bit to be more spread out between the 1 to 2 year mark. So just some key takeaways here. Early outreach really can influence candidate offers. So as we saw, nearly 50% of candidates had been exposed to a company they ultimately accepted an offer with. Another important thing is new hires want you to stay in touch post-offer. So while we are just about to start the internship season or welcome new grads, this is definitely helpful to think about, just as those candidates, as they finish or as you're planning for next fall, of how you can make sure you set up the infrastructure to really stay in touch with candidates consistently throughout the year. And then finally, as we saw with both renegs and why candidates are accepting offers, compensation and career growth really influences choices in terms of what company they want to go with, if they're going to rescind that offer or not. So that's definitely important to know as you both consider what compensation you'll be offering in the year ahead, and also as you design those interview processes. Moving on to trend area number 3, which is role listings. So trends about how roles are posted, skills that recruiters are looking for, as well as some salary trends. So interesting data, just looking at the past year. We took a look at the roles that were labeled as in-person, hybrid, or remote, just from the past year. And interestingly, we actually saw the majority of our roles are listed as in-person, and a smaller share is listed as hybrid, and even smaller share is listed as remote. What's notable about this is it feels like most roles these days are actually hybrid. So I was surprised to see that a lot of our roles are listed as in person. The reasoning behind this that I see is when you list something as hybrid, it's definitely a lot harder to, really describe, we're 3 days a week in person, or, we're come in when you want. So I do think that there's kind of just a more of a leaning toward in person and saying like, you're going to be expected to be here 3 days a week, and then maybe add on flexibility on top of that, rather than leading with hybrid, which has a lot of preconceived notions of what, hybrid means something different to so many folks. So I think in this early career space, we're seeing that folks are leaning toward in person, especially if their roles are going to require, 3 to 4 days in the office a week, rather than kind of starting with that looser expectation of hybrid. Another interesting point, and we'll share some of our salary data now, is the share of roles with compensation listed has increased from the previous season, but it's definitely not the majority. So about 38% of the roles on our platform listed by companies have compensation attached, and the numbers pretty much the same depending on internships or full-time roles, and the other 62% do not have compensation listed. This is definitely up from the 2022-2023 season, when only 21% of our roles had compensation attached. So this is definitely showing this moving trend towards salary transparency, whether that's forced by some of the laws that have been passed, or companies just moving in that direction of salary transparency. And then in terms of how internship compensation is listed, we see that the majority of internships listed have an hourly pay rate. So we saw a much smaller share have stipend, about 7% are a salary that are listed, but 92% of those roles do tend to be an hourly rate. And now to look at some of the average salaries of some of these full-time roles, and I'll just pop the link in the chat again in case someone wants to access that corresponding salary report. But in terms of the listings on our job, and this is just, again, a sampling of some of the data that's in our larger 75-page report, but we looked at the pay of over 1,100 listings that are submitted by those verified employers on the RippleMatch platform, to really get a sense of what are those top paying roles. In the report itself, we do dive into the different percentiles, so 90th, 50th, and 10th percentile, as well as more location data, which we will share a little bit that later in this presentation. But what we're looking at today is the 50th percentile of the salary maximum. So as you know, a lot of folks post both their minimum range in a salary and their maximum. So the data we collected has that minimum and then the maximum. And so we looked at the median of both of those. But for this, you can just kind of see what is the average highest amount that some of these job titles for early career are paying. As you can see, for software engineering, the 50th percentile of that salary maximum is 130,000. Electrical engineering is 110,000. Product management is 100,000. For finance and business roles, we're seeing investment banking is pulling in the highest salary at 120,000. Accounting is seeing a median of 90,000. And again, this is the maximum. The minimum range is also a different number, but this is the average of the highest amount that some of these roles are pulling in for new grads. Operations is 70,000. And then for people-facing roles, you can see those are much lower, with HR and recruiting playing about 65,000 as a median maximum salary, sales 60,000, marketing 60,000. So hardware, that is specifically as so in the report, we got pretty granular with these job titles. Hardware engineering is actually the role titles that specifically listed hardware engineering. So in the report, we list out mechanical engineering, manufacturing engineering, electrical engineering, actually all fully separate within engineering. So hardware engineering would be things like the GPUs. It would be like actual computer parts rather than software engineering. So we included hardware engineering because several of the companies actually did list hardware engineering specifically separate from software engineering or general engineering. So we do get pretty granular in the report about the different types of engineering. We tried to separate it out based on the explicit job title, since I know a lot of reports sometimes batch together, just general engineering, which can be pretty hard to actually benchmark what it is. So we tried to get pretty granular there. In terms of student salary expectations, we looked actually at the average minimum salary preferences around 20,000 students. So this is a sampling of the majors. Each of these have about 18 majors listed in STEM, finance and business, and people facing. But this is interesting because we've asked candidates on our platform, when they're signing up, when they're applying for roles, what is the average, what is the salary minimum that they would want when they're looking for roles? And at an average, you can see that this is about what candidates are expecting as the floor of what they would be hoping to get in a role. So computer science majors, they're obviously oftentimes pulling in a much higher salary than this, but their minimum expectation is around 75,000. We see it definitely is lower in some other things like finance is 61,000, sales is 59,000. Community majors, a lot of folks actually have a pretty high salary expectation, but it's just helpful to know that most candidates are really hoping to get between $60,000 and $80,000 at minimum for their first job. And then a couple look at internships. So we see that some of the highest paid internships are pretty similar to the highest paying full-time roles. And again, this is the 50th percentile of the wage maximum. So if you want to see what the minimum is, that would be in the report itself. We just listed the maximum to kind of show, on average, what are folks getting at that higher level. So you see software engineering, it's as high as sometimes 50 an hour at a median, definitely lower for those finance and business roles, down into the 20s. And then same with the people-facing roles, with the highest people-facing role commanding $36 an hour with a legal internship. So the sales compensation, I would say that is just base pay only because we're just going off of what is submitted by employers in the specific pay ranges. So I would say, and we mentioned this in the report too, that there's no specific mention of OTE or bonuses. So I would say the sales is just the base pay only. And in general, all of the salary, especially with these full-time ones, don't account for bonuses unless a company decided to lump that in with the salary that they're listing on the platform. So moving away from salary, we have some data on the most requested skills by recruiters, so technical roles versus non-tech. And interestingly, regardless of if it's STEM or non-STEM, we see that Excel and Microsoft Office is showing up consistently as one of the most in-demand skills according to recruitment teams. So for STEM roles, we see some common ones like Python, C++, SQL, so really common programming languages show up, but then Excel is right up there, and that's also up there for non-STEM. So if you're kind of considering what are folks looking for with skills, Excel is definitely still topping the list. So that ability to make spreadsheets is definitely still topping the list as one of the most important skills that folks can bring in here. In terms of school prestige, are folks going to different universities? Are they looking when they're doing virtual recruitment to get more elite schools? We're seeing that most of the companies on our platform are not really emphasizing the importance of a top 20 school or a top 50 school in any of their algorithms. And they're definitely bringing in candidates from schools all across the country, rather than focusing on, some of those outdated school prestige notions of saying, yes, we want to see schools more often in the top 20 or top 50. And then in the terms of the most requested schools, so with RippleMatch, you can automate a lot of your sourcing. So you can have candidates surface that come from different universities. So you can put a general filter for HBCUs. Say you want to see HBCUs, but you could also write in specific schools you want to see candidates from. And the most requested schools that we saw were actually HBCUs. So this is just looking at how frequently were these different schools requested. And then, we ranked that. So you can see that HBCUs are, among the most highly requested schools. Nearly all of the most requested schools actually are HBCUs, with some HSIs mixed in. And notably, it's not the most well-known HBCUs that are necessarily requested, but definitely some of those smaller ones or ones that are definitely still large, well-respected institutions, but aren't, Howard University or Spelman. Those are definitely still requested, but they're not necessarily taking that top 5 spot of most often requested. And that is our section there. So just some key takeaways here before our final section. We see that STEM roles are really the highest paying for new grads and interns. You can see from that salary analysis data that STEM careers really are commanding the highest pay. And again, we have a lot more data throughout the report with 20 different business functions where we really get in depth about the different salary for both full-time and intern. Excel is another really in-demand skill for both those STEM and non-STEM roles. And then HBCUs are definitely in very high demand for sourcing. For our last section, and I encourage you, if you have questions, feel free to start submitting those in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll tackle that after this last section. But our last section really focuses on some relocation and geographical trends. So when candidates make a profile with RippleMatch, they have that option to input their location preference to really help shape those jobs they're matched with. So interestingly, the largest share of candidates don't actually have a preference for their location. I imagine when they're setting up their profile, they want to see all of the options, don't potentially want to limit themselves by seeing less options all across in terms of in-person or remote. So there's not a huge preference, but then we do see after that a fairly even split between in-person, remote, or hybrid. So again, candidates are, when they're in that initial job searching phase, they want to just see all of the roles that are available rather than, limiting themselves by saying, I only want to work remote or only in person. When it comes to actual location of, where do you want to physically be, we see that candidates say location is either somewhat or very important. So it definitely does play into that. And then we have candidates have the options, we're going to go over that on the next slide, to write down if they have a preference for states or cities or both. So the preferences largely are, if candidates say that location is important, they're more tied to specific states than saying they want to work for a specific city. That said, we'll go into how this varies by region, but what our data shows us is that in general, candidates are most interested in staying in their home region or moving to well-known large cities. So the way that we looked at this is looked at either where the candidate is attending college or their home state, and kind of counted that as their home region, and then looked at their relocation preference. So the top most requested state, they definitely correspond with where candidates are located region-wise. So those on the West Coast, the number one most requested state was California, Midwest is Illinois, South is Texas, Northeast is New York. But the city that is most requested actually does not necessarily correspond with the region. So New York City, which is where I'm located. So it's cool to see that we're number one is the most requested city for every region except the West Coast. Looking at this a little bit closer, as I mentioned, there's a clear preference for candidates that are in that specific region to want to stay there, but they definitely are open to relocating to other cities. So those in the West Coast do have that preference to stay in their region, listing more of those West Coast cities. Those in the Midwest are definitely a bit more mobile when it comes to relocating to different cities. While the states that they have the most preference for tend to be these Midwestern states, we see that they're open to relocating to cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, Seattle. So there's definitely that openness to relocating to cities that are, well-known or larger. We see this as well in the South. While candidates in the South are, more interested in really staying in some of those states that they're tied to, there is that openness to relocate to New York or San Francisco, though they are oftentimes listing those cities that are also located in the South. Those who are based in the Northeast kind of would prefer to stay in the Northeast or relocate to the West, but we do see Chicago make an appearance as some of those most requested cities. So definitely the takeaway here is, not surprisingly, if a candidate has ties to a specific state or they attend college there, it's likely that, if they have to be in somewhere that's not like a really attractive city for, young folks, they might want to just stay in that state where they're located so they have a bit of a community. But if they're willing to relocate, they do want to relocate somewhere that's vibrant, that likely has a community available to them. Moving on to a bit of pay data, and we do have more pay information in that salary benchmarking report that I had dropped in the chat. There's about 20 pages of salary data, but looking at some of the, information here of the highest paying states, so a little bit of information on the highest paying states in each region. So this is the median minimum pay. So in terms of how we looked at the pay, depending on location, we looked at the minimum pay that was provided for the state, as a lot of times the job listings had a same pay depending on the state. So if there's one job listing that had multiple locations, they kept a pay range from, maybe 60,000 to 80,000, depending on the same location. So for this, we looked at the median minimum just to get a sense of, where is the floor to what a candidate would make if they moved to different states. So the highest paying region is definitely the Northeast. In this sense, with New York, the median minimum pay in that state is 72,500, with the lowest is the Midwest at 60,000. And we're just going to look at a couple of the top paying states for some commonly listed job titles. And again, we have a lot more of this in the report for many of our job titles and job functions listed. So you can see here the median salary minimum and median salary maximum for these different states for software engineers. So the median salary minimum, Texas actually offers the lowest median or highest median salary minimum at 100,000, with other coastal states offering the highest pay. The highest paying median salary maximum was also Texas. And then for internships, we see the highest paying is New York, DC, Washington. So definitely those coastal states are offering a higher pay for software engineers. For finance and business analysts, we see again this kind of centralized in the coastal states in Massachusetts, New York, Delaware are offering the highest salary for those who are categorized as finance and business analysts. And in the report, we do provide context on some of the common job titles that show up and how that varies depending on the upper compensation percentile as well as lower. And then internships, this is a theme that we saw kind of throughout the report, is internships definitely varied more from state to state, and there weren't as many commonalities of internships being a lot more higher paying on the coasts. There is definitely more variance in internship pay kind of across the country, offering more competitive wages. Rather than, with full-time roles, we definitely see lower salaries centered in the Midwest and the South. It's just another example. Sales roles, we see the internship pay varies here as well. So key takeaways there, and then we are just about at our time for open questions, but candidates want to maintain ties to home regions, but they are open to relocating to well-known cities, and we definitely are seeing that coastal states offer the highest pay to early career hires, especially with full-time roles. So some general final takeaways before we move into questions. I would say maintaining multiple touch points with candidates in the recruitment process and post-offer. So we see that candidates are really finding opportunities from a variety of different influences, from their classes, from going to the career page of a specific company to, previous work experience. And then they do want to hear from you throughout the year after they've accepted an offer. They want to be connected with folks from the company. So I would definitely say giving that multi-touch process and making sure you're connecting with them throughout the year is a really important thing. We saw that STEM-based skills and careers are commanding the highest pay, and candidates are definitely heavily influenced by compensation as career growth. We saw that with our renege data, that those are the number one reason candidates renege on an offer, but it's also the reason that they would accept an offer. So those are things that are really important to figure out ahead of fall, is how you're going to go into that with that strategy to really be competitive with candidates, offer them compensation that aligns with their expectations, but also how are you aligning with this expectation and desire they have for career growth. On that note, I would love to just go through any questions. So I would say, let's take a look at some of these. How important are housing stipends or bonuses for internships? How much employers offer, and at what frequency, one-time pay or monthly? So I don't have specific data on how many employers offer housing or stipend, or how important from a data perspective it is, but we did host a panel recently, about 2 weeks ago, where we hosted 4 Gen Z incoming interns, and they talked all about, how can a company put on a successful internship program? And we did get this question about housing stipends, bonuses for internships, and it definitely came up that relocation stipends, paying for housing, is so impactful to offer to internships. From what they said, it's pretty rare that it does come up. I think maybe 1 or 2 folks out of that panel, maybe just 1 folks had a specific stipend for housing or relocation. And so it isn't something that comes up from every company, but they said that all of their network and their peers say that a relocation stipend or a company handling housing is so impactful, because housing is so unpredictable in so many markets. And, living in New York City, a year ago, the rents were so much lower than they are, even this year. So I think with interns, them going into this housing market, having to figure out how to get housing and just the variability of how much it can cost, I think figuring out how to reduce the cost burden of housing through a stipend, or, getting wholesale housing through dorms you can offer your interns, is definitely something that is really appreciated and can set an employer apart when it comes to that compensation. Yeah, and that's helpful too. Oh, and then I see a question about just Yeah. And a lot of the sales roles, the median was pretty standard across the board for the full-time roles, but it definitely had a lot more variance for internships. So I'll just leave that up for a second. But yeah, any other questions that folks have? I see another one. Gonna just skip back to this now. Should employers be providing assistance with finding internship housing? So I would say if there's any way you can be helpful with housing, I think that is going to be so helpful to interns. Especially this came up, like I said, a lot in our intern panel where folks were saying it's really challenging to navigate going to a city. Another thing that came up was, if you're in a city that is if you're in a city that doesn't have great public transportation, which New York has great public transportation, but a lot of cities lack that infrastructure. And especially if an intern is going to live outside of the city to save money, figuring out if you can offer a car or a stipend for a rental car or anything that can just help support that, I think is really interesting, especially if you're requiring that candidates come into the office or interns come into the office frequently. I think that moving to that city and kind of trying to set up the infrastructure to commute into the office or live near the office is definitely a really big, intimidating challenge. So I think any way that you can provide that support, communicate that, at least multiple months in advance. So if you have an internship program, communicating that all the way back in January, because many candidates or even earlier, many hires are probably going to start thinking about that during that time of, what am I going to do about housing going into the summer? I think that's a really impactful thing that can be offered. Any other questions that we have? Because if there's no questions, I'll kind of wind things down, but I want to give anyone a chance to ask any questions about the data, anything that came up, any questions about data we might have or have access to. Let's see, something popped up. Yes, I do have some data. This question is, do you have any data regarding interview processes, number of rounds students expect, et cetera? I have a data point that I shared in a previous presentation for NACE, so I didn't bring it here, but the most significant data point I have about interview processes is that 79% of candidates expect the entire hiring process or hope that it'll only take about 1 month. So candidates are really ideally hoping that the interview process, hiring process in general, is pretty concise and that they can move through it fairly quickly. So of course, that might not be realistic for it to happen in just 1 month. But we also have data that shows candidates it can be a really negative experience if they're going through the interview process and they don't know where they stand. They don't know how many rounds are left. They're not really sure how long it's going to take in general. So I think the best data I have to share on hiring processes, interviews in general, is how can you create a tight feedback loop and making sure that you're keeping candidates in the loop so they are never in this position where they're, thinking, I don't know when my next interview is. I don't really know where I stand in this process. I'm not sure how long this would take. That's what we've seen time and time again from this data. Okay, any other questions that anyone has? Otherwise, we'll wrap up shortly. I'll give everyone just another moment to think if they have anything that they want to submit. Of course, you can connect with me on LinkedIn as well if you do have any questions that come up that you want to ask me later on that we didn't get to this time around. But it looks like there are no other questions. I'll just drop that link in the chat one more time. But I guess in that rate, I will hand it back to the NACE team and we can end today's webinar. So thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope all of this information was insightful and definitely feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Would love to stay in touch. So I'll stop sharing my screen and hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Kate, for sharing those insights with the NACE community. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of your week. Bye for now.
Thank you.